Canon has made some amazing lenses for the RF mount, and through this channel I've been lucky enough to try most of them. But in terms of pure performance, I think the RF 85mm 1.2 prime lens is the best lens that Canon has ever made, and this is my long-term review of the Portrait King. Alright, so why is the RF 85mm 1.2 the best lens Canon has ever made? Well, there's a couple of reasons. For example, its absolutely uncompromised image quality and the fact that it has beautiful rendering and character. And it's also an extremely versatile focal length for shooting people, and it's very well made too. But first and foremost, let's cover the most important thing, which is, of course, image quality. This lens is probably the only lens that I have ever used that is absolutely stunningly sharp from the center of the frame right out to the absolute extremities of the frame, right from wide open. And wide open on this lens is a staggeringly fast f1.2 aperture, which is no easy feat to achieve. This lens renders headshots in incredible detail. And of course, 85mm renders a really flattering headshot, but this lens captures skin detail and eye detail in ridiculous quality. No small details are missed with this lens, so prepare for a lot of retouching. I've used this lens extensively on my high megapixel Canon R5, and let me tell you, this lens eats this 45 megapixel sensor for breakfast right from f1.2. And this level of sharpness gives images tons of 3D pop, as the in-focus areas are rendered ridiculously sharp, whilst the out of focus areas are rendered creamy smooth, giving you the ultimate separation between subject and background with beautiful focus fall off too. This makes full-length portraits, for example, absolutely pop, and it's one of my favorite ways to use this lens. And I think part of what makes images from this lens pop so much is the absolute absence of any kind of chromatic aberration. And to the level, to be honest, I haven't seen in any other lens that I have tested. This lens is seriously clean and well corrected, again, right from f1.2. But despite how clean this lens is, it still has beautiful character, and the bokeh from this lens is some of the best that I have ever seen. It's worth noting that there is a more expensive defocus smoothing version of this lens that again smooths the bokeh out a little bit more at the cost of some light transmission, but I've yet to try out that version of this lens. Regardless, the bokeh from this lens is super smooth and creamy, but it is the focus fall off between the in-focus areas to the out-of-focus areas that renders an almost medium format look for portraits. This creates some painterly, almost dream-like looking portraits, especially for headshots. But another thing I love about this lens, which is often overlooked when people talk about the character of lenses, is how it renders out of focus areas in the foreground. Although often a weak spot in other lenses, this lens renders out of focus areas in the foreground really beautifully too. Again, despite being razor sharp. Sometimes these elements on other lenses can get quite busy and distracting, but not on this 85mm 1.2. Despite being a short telephoto lens well suited for that classic headshot look, of course, it is still an extremely versatile focal length for shooting people in general. Full-length shots have that amazing pop off the background 3D look that I mentioned earlier. You do have to have a decent amount of space to work with to get this look, which outdoors is no problem, and it still keeps you in the range where it's easy to communicate with your subject. You do still capture some of the background when shooting full-length shots at 85mm, but there is just no other lens that gives you this 3D look when shooting full-length portraits of people. And yet this lens is amazing for headshots, of course, like I mentioned earlier, but it's also one of my favorite lenses for taking mid-length shots of people. This lens obliterates busy backgrounds at this kind of working distance and allows you to pick out, say, small patches of interesting backgrounds and turn them into out-of-focus, painterly backdrops. You don't even have to shoot wide open at 1.2 to get this kind of look. You can step down to f2, f2.8, and this lens still does an amazing job of taming those busy backgrounds. And we all know that 85mm is a great focal length for headshots, so here is a few examples of the beautiful, flattering rendering you get with this lens. And an 85mm prime is an absolute staple among wedding photographers too. For capturing emotions, candids, or for ceremonies where you need that little bit of extra reach, this lens is exceptional and pairs wonderfully with, say, a wider angle prime lens like a 35mm, for example. For weddings or, say, indoor sports or just events in general, this kind of lens is going to really make your work stand out amongst the rest. And this lens, despite moving around some really big and heavy glass, actually has really fast and reliable autofocus too. It's not the fastest on the RF mount, but it's definitely, say, leaps and bounds ahead of the EF equivalent of this lens, and I've always found it to be really reliable and accurate. Before we carry on with the rest of the video, I'm just going to take a minute to let you know that this video is sponsored by Squarespace. Your photography work deserves an amazing website to showcase it to potential clients, and for me, there is no better option out there right now than Squarespace. The reason I'm always recommending Squarespace to friends and colleagues is that you don't need any prior experience in website design or coding or building to get started and build your own amazing website. Thanks to Squarespace's intuitive, fluid engine, most changes you're going to want to make to your website are as simple as drag and drop. Squarespace, in my opinion, offer the best customizable photo galleries that are so easy to set up, so you will be up and running and showcasing your work to potential clients in no time. And if you have products to sell, whether that be physical or digital, well, Squarespace has all of the tools you need to build and design your own shopfront quickly and easily. So if you're ready to dive in and create your own perfect website, head on over to squarespace.com/JamesReader and use the code JamesReader to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website. Thanks to Squarespace as always. Let's get on with the rest of the video. So this is an expensive lens, and all of that quality and the f1.2 maximum aperture comes at a heavy cost. So is it worth it? Let's look at what that f1.2 aperture gets you. So here is a comparison at 85mm, of course, comparing f1.2 against f2 and f2.8. So you can see the huge difference in how the background is absolutely obliterated at f1.2, even compared to f2. And now here's the same comparison, this time with headshots, where the 1.2 looks amazing, sure, but you only have a very small amount of the face in focus now because of that super fast aperture, which provides an extremely shallow depth of field at this kind of working distance. Here's another comparison against another extremely popular lens for portrait photography, the 70-200 2.8 zoom lens at 200mm at 2.8 versus the 85mm at 1.2. And even despite the vast difference in focal length between 85mm and 200mm, the 85mm 1.2 still renders a smoother background. It is, of course, a very different look, but one that can be achieved at a much closer and more convenient working distance compared to how far you have to be away from your subject at 200mm. Now here is the lens's closest competitor, the 135mm 1.8 RF lens, which is almost as sharp as the 85mm and does render a very similar look. But still, side by side, I do generally prefer the rendering of the 85mm 1.2, which does have the slightly smoother focus fall off thanks to that faster aperture. And here's a quick look at my personal favorite lens, the RF 50mm 1.2, up against the 85mm 1.2 for something like a full-length portrait. And you can see just how much more the subject stands off of the background with the 85mm lens, which is also a little bit more clinically sharp than the RF 50mm 1.2 in my opinion, which although is not as sharp and not as clean, does have a little bit more character to it still. By the way, I have put together a Dropbox folder full of RAW files from this lens, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can download the RAW files and take a look at the stunning image quality of this lens for yourself. The link to that Dropbox folder is down in the description. Now onto the build quality of this lens, and if there is a downside or a flaw to this lens, it is definitely the fact that it is a big, heavy lens. On a full frame camera with a decent grip like the Canon R5, it is pretty comfortable to use despite being a little bit front heavy thanks to that massive front element. I would suggest renting this lens and trying it out for yourself, especially if you plan to use it for, say, weddings or events, as it can be a little bit fatiguing to use over long periods of time. Other than that, the lens has a pretty simple design. It just has switches for limiting the focus distance and for toggling between manual and autofocus. It does have a command wheel, of course, being an RF lens, and it has a smooth focus ring, but no other function buttons or lens stabilization here, I'm afraid. Overall, this lens is extremely well built. It feels really solid in the hands and is definitely designed to withstand the elements and perform for many years to come. So if you are looking for the absolute best portrait lens on the RF mount, or pretty much any mount for that matter, well then in that case the RF 85mm 1.2 may be your answer. This lens has sublime image quality and sharpness while still retaining beautiful rendering and character. This is a really expensive lens, don't get me wrong, it is a huge investment to make in a single lens. But if you are a working professional, then a lens like this can really make your work stand out amongst the rest. And it is very versatile too, whether you shoot in the studio or you shoot couples, portraits or weddings, events or indoor sports. This lens performs incredibly well. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Let me know down in the comments, what is the best lens that you have ever used? Anyway, thanks as always for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you guys in the next one.